Well, good morning. As Steve said, appreciate you coming out this morning. This is kind of somewhat of a crash course of sorts of the history of where some of these technologies came from and hopefully where they're going. My background is in education, so it's kind of more of an educational focus. And then Reed has actually done a number of projects involving the development, so he'll talk a little bit about that process, right? Pretty much, yeah. So we'll just kind of jump into it. This may go for the full time, may not. We'll just kind of play it by ear, and then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A, and you guys can grill us and see what we really know. But basically, my background has been in education, specifically museum education, about 15 years. I started working at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, which is 2 museums down in the Williamsburg area. And basically, you know, I was looking for a summer job. There was a job where you could dress up and shoot guns and talk to people, so it sounded like a pretty cool job. And in that, you know, it very quickly became a career. But part of that was a lot of program development. And if you know anything about cultural institutions, museums especially, one of the biggest things that's always in want is resources, money. And so, you know, you really have to kind of hustle to make things happen. So started at, you know, just kind of doing the on-site thing, did outreach education, and one part of outreach education was providing educational resources for teachers, and that led to producing educational videos in-house at the museum, and we basically went from using consumer-grade camcorders all the way up to getting the better stuff and producing those for educators. And during the course of that process of talking to educators, has anybody ever used or seen a smartboard in the classroom, right? You know what I'm talking about? Well, most teachers are using those as nothing more than a glorified whiteboard. And it drove me crazy because there's this incredible potential that you can have with these smart devices, but there's not really the support to learn how to use them in an efficient way. So that was what kind of drew me to the educational technology side of things. So eventually I made my way to Jamestown Rediscovery, which is an active archaeological project where they're finding artifacts all the time. But from an educational standpoint, it's kind of hard to teach about things you can't touch and you can't really see in really abstract concepts. So we partnered with the Virtual Curation Lab at Virginia Commonwealth University. We 3D scanned objects from the collection and objects that were being found. We 3D printed those, and then we used those with the public to, you know, create these educational lessons. But one of the things about artifacts is the most important piece of that is the context, where it's found, to tell the story and the real meaning behind the object. And it's really hard to do that with archaeology because with archaeology, it's a destructive process. As you're digging, it all goes away, and to document that and show that to the visitor is kind of a challenging thing. So I basically just started taking 360 photos and showing, you know, photospheres or whatever. And then 2015, when the cardboard came out, that was my first kind of introduction to, you know, low-level virtual reality and being able to provide the context. People, you know, putting these goggles on and watching people try to step forward into the pit with very funny results as a result, really kind of showed me what kind of capability was there. So just a few pictures there to show you how excited kids got when they were using you know, the Gear VR. Give you a little idea as far as what the scanning and printing process was, but can anybody see who that gentleman is in the top corner? Anybody know who that is with the bucket hat? It's Weird Al. So Weird Al came out, and I almost got to 3D scan him. He was a little apprehensive, so his wife stepped in to cut him some slack. But Weird Al loves virtual viewers, by the way. He was pretty tickled by it. So again, these are just examples of some early attempts at 360 photo. Google had something, which I think is still out there, called Stereospheres, where you can actually embed audio hotspots. So as you look at those different points, you can get a narrative about what you're looking at that came from the archaeologists. And then later on, as you know, I continued through my career, I got my master's degree in master's education, instructional, curriculum instruction with a focus on instructional technology. And what I was looking at there was virtual classrooms with very, very interesting results. And I got consulted, asked to consult on a project with the United States Postal Service creating virtual educational experiences. And so these are some screenshots from the experience that another developer actually put together, two guys I know. But the concepts of using this technology to create an educational experience around stamps And that was quite a challenge because, as you can imagine, you know, stamps are just these tiny little things, and how do you kind of make those come to life? So some screenshots there. So when we talk about VR, I love this slide because these are all different variations throughout the years of what VR has been and can be. The one in the center especially is quite interesting. But when you talk to people about virtual reality, they have all these different conceptions of what it is, and they have all these different levels of experience they've had. So just by show of hands, how many people have had a virtual reality experience? That's awesome. I don't usually see that many hands. And one of the big things, of course, is what level of virtual reality experience have you had? And you may talk to somebody who's, all they've done is they've done maybe a 360 photo, and they're talking about doing virtual reality all the way up to a super intense haptic experience with the vest and everything else. So as far as definitions go, Wikipedia is always a good spot to start. There's a lot of different variations out there. This particular definition, I think, kind of sums it up pretty well. And, you know, the idea of, you know, whether a 360 video or a computer-generated environment is virtual reality, up to debate, but I think ultimately it's a simulated environment is typically when you get to the highest level of a virtual reality experience. Basically, when we talk about augmented reality, how many people have had an augmented reality experience? I'm not expecting to see just as many hands. So just kind of point out a few things you see here. You've got the IKEA example, of course, a really great example of a kind of a consumer interaction with the different products. Down in the left corner on my computer, I don't know where it is there, but the little 2D cutout you see, that's actually from a company called ArtGlass. And so they're doing augmented reality educational experiences using the Epson, I think it's called Maverio, which are augmented reality headwear. And that's at the Highland. Mount Vernon also, I think they've started running it as well, but they're also working with them to do the same thing, to do these, I think they did volumetric capture for that. The Pokemon Go phenomenon, of course, is still running. The Jurassic World one was pretty fun for a while, but then also the directional capability that will be built into Google Maps is pretty exciting as well. Two big things with that, of course, are AR Core and AR Kit. Explaining that to people is always really fun, but just the capabilities that brings to just regular consumer devices is a really exciting development. Just as far as a definition for augmented reality, you know, it's essentially an overlay of information. Not going to go into super deep detail about the AR MR debate of you know what is AR, what is MR. But for the most part, when you talk to somebody about augmented reality, Pokemon Go is a good reference point that typically settles things. But one thing that I have found has been really exciting to show people, and you may have seen this before, is that AR portal concept of using that content that's created, anchoring it, and you know this is capable with AR Core as well as AR Kit, and being able to enter into that content, whether it be a 360 photo, video, or again, computer-generated content. So there's an example there. If you haven't seen one, or if you haven't done one, it's a really, really great way to start playing around with this stuff. And you can actually see the real world, of course, through that portal entry. If it stops playing. It won't let me advance here. There we go. Another cool product I found, which I wouldn't recommend for, you know, kind of the newcomer, but if you really want to kind of play with some interesting content, is the Horizon, and hopefully this will play. So this is essentially trying to approximate the idea of using an augmented reality headset, but that same kind of idea with the Google Cardboard, and actually doing an overlay with that content. But there's not a lot of content for it right now, but it has pretty impressive results when it works, which is the key word there. I'm going to fast forward this a little bit. So you can see you basically have your device, you place it in there, and it's got like this transparency that lets you see right through it. Moving on to, I keep getting locked out here. Moving on to MR. So again, a few examples. One of the most impressive, obviously, is that whale, which is not real. If you ever see that, there's a lot of folks out there who are expecting Magic Leap to be that. It's not. But still that idea of that demo you see over on the other side, that is a real, actual screenshot from the Magic Leap headset. The HoloLens, of course, is really exciting, and then there's some examples there from the Leap Motion folks and Project Northstar. So mixed reality, again, another definition for you as far as, you know, the biggest difference between augmented reality and mixed reality is, I would say, maybe spatial computing is a big component of that, whereas with augmented reality, it's an overlay of information, maybe a vertical or horizontal plane, there's some interaction there. Once you get to mixed reality, you're talking about being able to interact with objects within the space. And in that regard, we're now talking about, especially from a gamified experience, a much more immersive experience that can come from that. And so, again, this is just a short video. If you're not familiar with spatial mapping, showing, I guess my markers didn't work so well here for the videos, but you can see the content's actually interacting with objects within the room. So that's just kind of a short example of what mixed reality would look like when it's done well. And we're going to figure this out. So one other piece of mixed reality is when you talk about volumetric capture. Microsoft has all their different terms for it, but you know, volumetric capture is essentially. Hold on here. Is it playing? There we go. So you can see the content that's been captured. And it's supposed to show here in a moment the actual point of when the dancers were being captured. It should start here in a second. But again, with augmented reality versus mixed reality, you're able to incorporate this content in a much more efficient manner. I'm just going to let this play through for it real quick so you can see the transition. There we go. And it should show the final product here in just a second. I had markers on the video, but it looks like they didn't save through, so apologies for that. All right, enough of that. All right, so, and then, when you think about volumetric capture, you just saw that green screen studio, right, and all that sophisticated equipment, but one of the interesting developments with Jaunt, who was really big into VR, but recently announced basically they're jettisoning all their VR efforts, is a real-time volumetric capture being streamed in real time. So this is a really exciting demonstration, I think, of what we will eventually get to with even just your everyday device, and being able to do volumetric capture and sharing that content in a real-time environment. So when we talk about virtual reality, it's just kind of what I was interested in when I was doing school. One of the most interesting examples was what was done at the World Science Festival in 2017. So this is a virtual classroom taught by Brian Greene from Columbia University. And when you think about something like string theory, it's a really abstract concept, and how can you really teach that especially in 2 dimensions, let alone just with like the 3D content. So this classroom is actually full of international students, and they're all interacting with this basically like a Tesseract thing in real time. So this environment was being used to showcase a pretty complex lesson with students all over the world. And this is one of the most successful examples I've seen of a virtual classroom environment. Then we have Make VR, which originally came out for the Vive, and in this case you're talking about 3D modeling, but being able to export that 3D modeling content to a STL, so you're able to basically 3D print these creations you're creating, and a very user accessible. And it was actually built on a CAD engine, so you're talking about being able to go in here, create content, and then export that and bring it into the real world. And then Reed's going to talk a little bit about this later, but RealBlocks is I don't want to say the word. I won't say the word. I can't say the word, but very familiar.
There's nothing at all to do with any Danish toy company.
Not at all. Not in any way. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But again, using a virtual environment to basically literally build something and then export as well. And then Sketchfab. Has anybody heard of Sketchfab before? Hands for that. So if you want to basically start playing with some really interesting content, 3D content, Sketchfab has a lot of content from cultural institutions that have been 3D scanned or brought in from photogrammetry. and it has what artists are creating, and you can use this content in any number of ways. But one of the most exciting ways is just downloading the Sketchfab app, and you can project that content on any flat surface, both AR core and AR compatible. And then another great example I came across was basically using the HoloLens and using patient diagnosis using the HoloLens and MR. So I actually used this demo at a conference, and it's incredibly realistic in terms of the content that's being projected there. And everything just kind of went crazy there. Is that what you see up there? Did it go?
Yeah.
Did it freeze? Yeah, everything froze actually.
Oh, the whole thing?
Yep.
That's not bueno.
That's not good. Oh, and it just crashed. Anybody have a Chromebook? This is not unusual, unfortunately. So everything just went away. That's a little bit of a problem. The presentation is gone.
That's not good.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if it's going to kick back here or not. Yeah, so this is technology and all of its glory. Is it showing up there too? Okay, great. Okay, so just a few folks, like if you're really into this or not really into this, a great place to start is the research by Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab. Jeremy Bailenson is the director of that lab, and he's been doing this research for quite a long time. If you want a deep dive, but also a very accessible way to kind of learn about virtual reality and a lot of the research around that, Infinite Reality is a book that he recently came out with, which is a really great example of showing how the research is applicable to consumer applications, but also some gamified applications as well. Pretty much my hero, and one of my favorite anecdotes about, or stories about the Virtual Human Interaction Lab is their original, one of their apparatus for research was a $40,000 ceiling rig that they replaced with an Oculus DK1 or DK2. So if you think about that, $40,000 down to a few $100s, and obviously, the computational power, that level of accessibility that we now have is really, really exciting. Because Stanford research level equipment was replaced with an Oculus. That's a pretty exciting development. Chris Dede is really more in the educational space, but when you think about virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and education, they were basically doing these virtual environments on a traditional computer, but a lot of what they've developed from an instructional design standpoint is applicable to these new platforms. Ali. Its name, I'm going to mess it up. Ali Salame has basically this experience where it takes it's called death tolls, and what happens is when you read through different news articles and you see those numbers, those totals of people that were hurt or killed, we just kind of breeze past that really quickly, right? Imagine taking those numbers and visualizing that data. And so what he's done is he's actually created these experiences where he does the body count, and you actually walk through spaces where you see those bodies stacked up in some way. Incredibly profound experience. It's not currently publicly available, but everybody who's done the experience has had quite a profound experience. And this is one of the examples of the power of what this technology can do. Is it can take data and create visualizations around that. Another great experience is MIT Media's lab. Basically, you're a tree in a forest, and you kind of see the different configurations of what happens with deforestation and whatnot. And one really great low-tech example of creating a heightened experience is when you catch on fire, they just burn a match nearby, so you smell the smoke of the match. But then as the fire's going on in the VR experience, it causes people to kind of freak out a little bit. And then Guthrie Center actually recreated the Dust Bowl. So you experience basically a dust storm occurring in that regard. But the title of this, of course, is talking about the past, the present, and the future. So when we talk about the past, we actually have to go back really to we'll start here. We're talking about the 1860s, 1840s, somewhere in that regard. And just this very basic concept of a stereoscopic image, right? And what essentially happens is, it's an illusion of sorts, which is what happens here, to where you have two offset images that converge to create, a three-dimensional image. At least that's what you see. So the Wheatstone stereoscope is kind of the earliest example of that. The Brewster stereoscope kind of creates that enclosed environment, which essentially just adds to the level of convergence. But the one that probably most folks have seen before is the home stereoscope. And again, you have your focal ability by moving that image down the line. But this is essentially, when we talk about virtual reality today, this is where it starts, right? It's just the technology is different, but the same basic concept is there. And I think it's really important to kind of, look at that and remember that, because the building blocks for what we're going to do now and in the future all start with a very basic concept of an illusion. And that idea of creating something that isn't really there or is really there, and what that actually can mean. Everybody probably has seen one of these, right? The ViewMaster. In fact, this is one of the best ways when I'm educating folks about this technology, is referencing a ViewMaster as something that's more familiar to them that they may have used. But when we talk about, a virtual reality experience, a lot of times you'll see a reference to the Sensorama. This essentially, incorporated olfactory, so you had the smells, it had, the wind, it had these, three-dimensional images that were created, but it never really became a commercial success. It was just kind of a one-off thing. A lot of folks that are interested in this technology know about it, but from my understanding, there's still existing Sensораmas that aren't even in museums because, nobody wants to deal with the upkeep. But the same gentleman who did this, and I want to make sure I get his name right because I always get the last name right. So it's Morton Heilig's Sensorama. Also did the Telesphere, and if you look at the patent illustration, it looks pretty familiar, right? It looks like it looks like an early Oculus or early Oculus Go or Gear VR or whatever. But this is an actual existing product that he built that again never attained any kind of commercial success. A lot of times when you hear about the kind of the early days of tracking technology, this is a corporation that kind of went defunct, but they actually had a working tracking technology, HMD, and this was in the 1960s. I think it was in the 65 or so. But most of the time, actually, here we go. When you think about the kind of the earliest examples of these HMDs, you're talking about one of the most prominent advances in technology happening with NASA. So this video here is really cool because it basically is a motorcycle helmet with displays on it. This is the earliest, the earliest prototype, at least that I could find documented, that NASA was using. And if you look at the name NASA Vive, I thought that was kind of interesting. A nice little nod that HTC did a little bit later. But again, my markers are not showing up here, so I have to kind of scroll a bit.
Is it Vived or Vivid? Right? I think it's
Is it Vivid?
I think it's
All
Vivid.
right. Well, okay. So we got the we've got the wireframe display here, but where's the video? Yeah. So there you go. You can see the full apparatus, and again, it's just a motorcycle helmet with the displays and the tracking technology on the top there. But it evolves pretty quickly, and the next iteration of this is the View, which I could only find a picture of. But you can see just even in that generational leap, a significant reduction in terms of the complexity of what they're dealing with. And what you're seeing there is actually the data glove, which we'll see a little bit more about in just a second. But when you think about the first HMD, a lot of times it's going to be referenced by Sutherland's efforts. And so this is just a short video showing that, again, the level of complexity that was involved with these HMDs in the early point. But this is almost like I mean, they call it virtual reality, but it's almost more like augmented reality in the sense it's just this wireframe kind of floating around the space. But this particular example is oftentimes what's referenced as the first, the first HMD. But I just wanted you to be aware of the other things that were kind of going around that same time. So when we talk about Jarrell Linear, this quote is I think just kind of encompasses why virtual reality and all these different associated technologies are so important. is the transformative effect it's going to have. And this video in particular, I hope it has sound because, let's see if it has sound. You can't hear that. Well, at one point when he references the hardware, they actually called the headset the iPhone, which I thought was pretty interesting. The first iPhone was actually a VR headset. But this is the Data Glove, which was, as you saw earlier with the NASA prototype, that's initially what kind of got that partnership started, but then you have the actual HMD, which is significantly reduced. So you can see it there. I mean, look at the size difference just between the original NASA prototype and the device that's here. Let's get past that one. All right, so when we talk about kind of the modern transition, the biggest thing that kind of drives forward the technology today, I would argue, are smartphones, right? The screens, the processing power, the gyroscopes, and all these different components are really what allows for the reduction in size and the performance, be able to attain the performance that we're looking at with modern day headsets. So, when you think about the Oculus DK2 in 2012, essentially, it's Palmer Luckey, with this collection of headsets wanting to create something that's a lot more accessible to the general public. But in this particular case, it's using existing components to build something, to kind of cobble something together that meets a certain objective. So, 2012 is that Kickstarter project. I think it was in the summer, and suddenly you have people for the first time, seeing a possibility of having a consumer-accessible virtual reality headset. So that's the DK1. DK2 drastically. See my notes here. Drastically improves within a generation. Notes aren't showing up. But the idea here is with the DK2, a drastic improvement in terms of the displays. Again, the form factor. Talking about the actual refresh rate. So all these different advances are happening within just one iteration of the device. But then you have this kind of this sideways thing that happens in 2015 with the Google Cardboard. The Oculus is for the gamers, for the hardcore enthusiasts. But to get the general population interested and excited about this, Google realized, we need to make this as simple as taking a device you already have, placing it into some kind of apparatus that can allow you to experience this content. So, 2015. Well, you can argue 2012 is kind of when it becomes a lot more accessible to the general public. With the Google Cardboard, you now suddenly have it a lot more accessible to really anyone that has any interest in engaging with this content. And very simple idea, very simple concept, and tons and tons of variations of this came out. But 2015 is what I would argue is really when this starts to become something that's a lot more palpable to the population. Viewmaster 2.0, just again taking that same kind of concept with the Google Cardboard, but creating a lot more robust headset, especially for kids. This was a big deal for the educational community. And then, with Google Daydream and Samsung Gear VR, you're taking that concept and you're creating an even more refined experience. With the Samsung Gear VR, you now have an Oculus partnership where the software and the hardware, there's a marriage between the two, and you have an interface that's starting to be developed, which makes it a lot easier to access that content. And then we talk about the present. And does anybody have an Oculus Go here in the room? A few hands, right? Does anybody use an Oculus Go if you don't have one? Right, a few more hands, right? So the thing is, if you we're working with the Gear VR, you could basically take that content and immediately port it over to this device. And one of the biggest things with the Gear VR, of course, is you're trying to take something that's used every day as your phone and turn it into something else. It's not really, you're trying to make it be two things. With the Oculus Go, you now have an all-in-one device, which has everything you could want, including built-in audio in the head straps. And this now makes it more accessible than ever for people to start engaging with the content. So, for $200 or cheaper on sale, you now have the ability to immediately go into to engage with this content. So it makes things a lot more accessible, but it also suddenly starts to spur that development. And the possibilities of creating that content that now people are actually going to buy and experience. The Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, again, you have the difference between these technologies, and I'm not going to go into a deep dive, but you have 3 degrees of freedom, or 3 DOF, where you're looking kind of around and up and down, whereas you have 6 degrees of freedom, which now you have a room scale experience where you're actually able to move around. So both the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive allow for this experience, but both, again, you have to set up the sensors, you have to have a computer that can run it, and while a lot of those specifications have come down significantly, it still is not quite as accessible as something as easy as the Oculus Go. So where does that marriage happen where it's both the accessibility for everyone, but also the level of content that really will get people excited about VR? And that's when, that's what's coming here in just a little bit. But I also wanted to reference Microsoft MR, because when you hear Microsoft MR, it can be kind of confusing because mixed reality versus Microsoft MR, which is not true mixed reality. But these are just a number of pieces of hardware working with native software that now you can create the content, put it on Steam, and have it work across all of these devices. So again, that accessibility is getting closer and closer, and you can find these headsets under $100 sometimes on sale, even though they're still doing tracking. And the tracking they're using is what's called inside-out tracking. So instead of having sensors, you now have the ability to just use the headset and track within that space. But then you talk about, again, what I was talking about earlier, that marriage of removing the tether, right? Having that ability to move within a room scale environment, but still have engaging content. So both the HTC Vive Focus and the Lenovo Mirage Solo were kind of attempting to, are attempting to do that. But one of the exciting things about the Focus and the Solo is they have a 6 degrees of freedom movement with the headset, but then the actual controller is only 3 degrees of freedom. So there's a disconnect in terms of what you want to do within that versus what you can do. However, HTC Vive Focus has announced there will be a 6 degrees of freedom controller, and then Lenovo Mirage Solo actually now has a development kit that's out that allows for 6 degrees of freedom controller tracking with that headset. So you can do, you basically have the ability now to develop content using this dev kit that will allow for a full 6 degree of freedom experience. But what most people probably know here, or people are probably most excited about, is the project Oculus Santa Cruz, which was around for a few years. We're watching those developments. We're getting excited about what's coming, finally being announced with the Oculus Quest. Anybody heard of the Oculus Quest in this room? It's by far one of the most exciting developments, because what you now have is the ease of accessibility of a Go, but now you have the content level that you're going to have with the Oculus Rift. Maybe a little bit of variation. I mean, the computational power isn't fully there. But when you talk about the Climb, which is an amazing experience on the Oculus Oculus Rift, being compatible supposedly with the Oculus Quest, that kind of content is going to be pretty exciting. Another kind of player to the field is the PiMax 8K, which really is the 5K plus at this point. It's not truly 8K, but at the same time, you're talking about a field of view greatly expanded, close to 200. And from about the 100, 110 of current headsets. And apparently, I've got one on order. It's going to show up someday. It's a Kickstarter project. You know how that goes. But apparently, the experience has been pretty profound. Beat Saber, anybody know the game Beat Saber? Yeah, I see a lot of hands going for that, right? So with the PiMax, apparently it completely changes the game, literally, in terms of the experience. So pretty exciting. Something else that's coming out is a haptic vest with 8 transducers called the War Rig. I think they changed the name, but that, again, is adding a haptic component that'll be pretty exciting as well. So what's the future? Again, coming from an educational background, my general interest in this is the educational applications, but assessment especially. You can basically track right now with a headset like this. You can track where it's going, where it's looking, and you can determine interest. You can determine across the board based on a app deployment. You can see where users are engaging with the content. So that's a really exciting development. But another level of assessment is actually having eye tracking within the headset. So this will both improve on the content, but in terms of being able to see where the user's actually looking and actually being able to measure interest of users by measuring the pupil. So kind of creepy in some ways, but really exciting in others. It's kind of like you got to kind of walk that line.
Facebook is the one doing that, so
yeah,
just
That is true.
Yeah.
ValveKnuckle Controller, so these are going out. You want to talk about user interaction, user interface, significantly more promising than the current controller configurations that are out there, pressure sensitivity and whatnot. I haven't used these personally. I don't know if anyone out there has, but the feedback I've heard from folks who have has been very, very positive. Just the ability, it just expands the capabilities of what you're going to be able to do in that environment. Some of the examples in terms of game content that has actually incorporated this has been very promising. Another thing, when I was doing that virtual classroom, I was super excited about it, telling everybody about it. And one day somebody said, well, how do you take notes? And I just was about to have an answer and then realized I didn't have an answer. Like, how do you take notes in a virtual classroom? Well, something like a virtual keyboard, which is a HTC Vive tracker associated with this specialized hardware, and there's a few dev kits out there, now allows you to actually type in virtual reality. So it's a pretty exciting development that's coming. And then Project Northstar, if you're not familiar with Project Northstar, this is basically an attempt to kind of take that mixed reality headset like the HoloLens and Magic Leap and make it significantly more affordable using more accessible parts. This is a demo that Magic Leap put together that I think is really exciting because it shows through Project Northstar just how kind of instantaneous and accessible this technology can be. And who doesn't like to play ping pong? Has anybody ever played ping pong in virtual reality? Yeah, it can be dangerous. A little better here. So just a few numbers, and I came across, so 2016, and you're going to find a lot of data, a lot of different competing numbers out there. So don't take this as the one-all, but just a very general idea of what it was like in 2016. You're talking about 2 billion, give or take. 2018, pretty big jump. We're talking about 2 billion going to close to 17. Some really big developments in terms of the content that's coming out. But 2022 is looking a lot better in terms of the adoption rate. I just read the other day that apparently on Steam, the number of headsets doubled from last year. It's still like 1% of users, so it's not anything massive, but still double is pretty encouraging. And I think, again, with the Quest, when that comes out, it's going to be even more impressive. So, it's kind of hard to do a timeline because there are a lot of offshoots and whatnot, but, for the time we have and whatnot, hopefully that gave you some kind of idea of where we came from, where we are now, and then the later sessions, we'll be talking a lot more about what's coming and where that's gonna, what that's really gonna do. But one component of this is, there's the hardware and there's the software, but there's the developers, there's the content creators that are really gonna drive this forward. And so Reed agreed to join and kind of talk about that experience and his project and really whatever I'm not sure exactly what he's going to talk about. It's going to be awesome because he does awesome stuff.
I've been working in the VR space since, I don't know, I guess technically 2011. I built some content for a project being done by USC, and I live here in Virginia, so I was somewhat remote. And then I actually went out to California to see what they'd done with it. And this is before Oculus was out, and I didn't know what 6 Degrees of Freedom was, but they had a sound stage there, and it had a bunch of webcams pointed down at whoever was on the stage, and you had to wear this like Teletubby thing on your head that would like track where you were and stuff. But it was the first time I'd like experienced room scale, and so they put me in this thing, and it was like, I'm going back in time or something like that because I had to wear like a backpack and stuff. But I go in it and like I'm looking around, and it took me like a minute, but then I realized that I had actually made everything that I was looking at, but I didn't recognize it because I hadn't seen it from that perspective before. And that was kind of mind-blowing. You can get down and like look at it from underneath and stuff, and that blew my mind, and from that point I was hooked. I got the DK2 whenever that came out. I forget what year, 2013 or something like that.
Yeah.
And I didn't really do much with it. It's kind of boring for me to just sit there and look at a virtual environment. It wasn't until I got my Vive in 2016 that I really got into the development side of things. I was just an artist and animator for the most part, wrote a little bit of code, but then I really got into development because I was like, I just need to make this thing do what I want it to do. So I just slammed my head on it until it worked. And I realized I was kind of bad at writing code because my code was awful, and I knew it. So now I'm a college student again at George Mason studying computer science, just because this was such a motivator for me. But I haven't done anything professional in virtual reality except for my own personal projects that I'm working on in conjunction with Jeff here. Oh, yeah.
We'll see it. Bring it up.
Yeah, sure.
So we'll just play this as he's talking.
Yeah, you should definitely.
Yep.
So anyway, what I'm building right now is a blocks simulator. You know, like I basically in this scene, I shrank the user down to the size of like a little toy, and I think in this video in particular, I'm showing off how like I had just gotten it to work where you could climb up inside of the stuff and on top of it and stuff. I had to make these bigger blocks that would support all that, and I think that's the whole point of this video. But anyway, in my limited experience, because I mean, if anybody's like, oh, I've been doing VR for 20 years, they're lying, because VR really hasn't been what it is today for very long. In my own experience, I think it's from a developmental standpoint, everything's getting a lot better. When Vive first launched, Unreal didn't even have a forward renderer, which is required for virtual reality. It's not required, but it's very, you kind of want to use a forward renderer for it for technical reasons. Anyway, the point is that the developmental experience has gotten a lot better. Like the companies that are making the tools to develop for virtual reality or AR. I don't know much about AR, but for virtual reality specifically, they're getting better all the time. There's in third-party support. If you guys ever want to get into VR development, there's for Unity, there's the VRTK. For Unreal, there's the Unreal Virtual Reality plugin. I mean, if you Google these basic terms, you're going to find a bunch of third-party plugins that'll help you build whatever you want. Like, all of the heavy lifting's are already done, I guess is my point. You really don't have to write your own solutions for interacting with objects anymore. I do because I hate myself or something. I like the learning experience behind it, and I like to have an intimate understanding of how the objects are behaving and why they're doing what they're doing. Even though, like, oh man, like these blocks, I mean, they look like they work together pretty well, but let me tell you, that was a lot of work to get that to work. It became absurdly complicated. And something to keep in mind is if you're developing something for VR, like these are game engines, and you're not really, I mean, you're making a game, but you're kind of twisting the underlying technology in ways that it wasn't really designed to do, at least not initially. Like the physics, all these blocks are physical. And the physics engine, while it does keep up with what I'm asking it to do, it wasn't, I don't think they ever envisioned that like the developer would want, 500 physical objects all being simultaneously simulated, and then like, joining them together in this way, you know what I mean? So I run into like a lot of like unique problems that I think aren't really very commonplace in other areas of game development. But like I said, everything's getting a lot easier. You don't have to write your own solution for interacting with the objects anymore because, especially with Unreal, it comes out of the box with tools to do it for you. But yeah, anyway, that's the basic gist of my point. It's getting easier, so if you want to get into development, it's very accessible now compared to maybe how it was 2 years ago.
And I mean, at this point, we'll just do kind of finish up with any questions anyone has about anything, really.
Yeah.
There's a hand.
So I remember reading or seeing something about an HTC offering, going back to what you were talking about with the virtual keyboard inside Steam. So if say you're VR gaming or something like that, Steam's very good about having navigable interfaces that you can get around inside the VR environment, inside Steam, and do all that. But everybody who's playing anything realistic, man, I need a web browser. I need to be able to go into my web browser to get my, EDDB or HTC was putting a camera on the outside, so it wasn't necessarily going to be augmented reality so much as like you could switch to an outside real world view, which would also give you the capability to put down the gauntlets and find a keyboard or a mouse or a controller or, oh my gosh, my wife is here, hi honey, or whatever. Are there more moves in that direction to be able to make your experience immersive while you still have that kind of connection to the outside world and ability to interact?
Yeah, the regular Vive has a camera in the front of it, and you can access it somehow.
Yeah.
I have a Vive, but I have no idea how to do that. I know it exists, and I've seen people do it. I think it was there to like, every time I saw it used was like, hey, we're gonna be able to show you if there's a chair in front of you.
So it was like a wireframe.
Yeah, it would see the chair, and then it would like draw an outline of it in your application. I know that the Steam VR, I'm pretty sure you can access a web browser from virtual reality. So you can pause your game, hit a button, then the Steam VR interface comes up, and then you can just launch a web browser from there.
It's a term you want to.
No, you don't have to. You can type with the controllers.
Yeah, it's like a virtual keyboard.
Yeah, it's got like two thumb pads or whatever. I mean, it's not ideal by any means.
And the term you want to look for is pass-through. So when you see anybody referencing pass-through, they're talking about looking through the headset or looking through whatever. That's coming across the board.
It's like
a demand. Mirage can do it.
It's like HTC and Steam haven't really. It's like they have that camera on there, but nobody ever really uses it for anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of the people are using Unity to do VR, and the important part wasn't being able to use the keyboard. The important part was being able to use the editor. Well, recently they released the Unity editor with the access to VR. So rather than, this is the old school, you take your headphone off, do your typing, put that on and see what's going on. Because Unity can change on the fly without any issues. Now you can be inside VR, decide to change something, and then use the VR interface to actually change it.
Oh.
This is a work in progress. It's going to get better, but more and more of us want to actually edit VR within VR.
Well, I was just going to piggyback on what you're saying. Unreal has in the editor VR tools where like you're doing like terraforming or something. You're in the editor and you can like make a mountain in front of you and put down trees and build the scene. I know for Fortnite, for some of their special effects, like I remember seeing a presentation they did, but they had like a smoke effect that they couldn't get to work correctly, so they in VR went into the editor and like twirled the smoke to where they wanted it or whatever, and then saved that work and used it in the game.
What you see is what you get editor within VR. They don't want to have to go to the keyboard and type it in.
But for the most part, I am taking the thing off my head and typing and then putting it back on over and over and over again. It sucks, but yeah.
Yeah, in the back.
No.
Slept with it?
That would be awful.
I've fallen asleep with this guy, but not the.
It's really bright.
I
It would
mean,
be
yeah.
like going outside and just like even if your eyes are closed, like light shining. Yeah, it's not ideal though. Everything looks blurry and bad. You lose a lot of effects, but you kind of need just to the resolution of the devices themselves, which isn't really high enough. Like if you've ever used any of these things, even the best, except maybe the PiMax, which isn't really available, they all have the screen door effect, and you need to do super sampling and anti-aliasing as much as you can, and the deferred renderer isn't really going to let you get away with that as much.
Hopefully. In the front, yeah.
Yeah, the screen door effect, that's what I was going to ask was that
Yeah.
you guys have experienced the retinal projection that can bypass all that, and it helps with any corrective visioning and all that, but was it a Avante Glyph that does the retinal projection?
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Have you guys
I haven't used that. I've been interested in seeing how they do that. I mean, it doesn't seem like anyone's really progressing that particular direction except for them and maybe a few. I mean, even Magically was looking at that a while back, I think. I don't know why exactly they're not. I just know it probably from a cost standpoint. You know, if you're talking about the number of folks who are doing the research versus in this particular area versus this area, I mean, most of it's toward getting something that's affordable, reliable, doesn't make people sick, and maybe, I don't know for sure, but maybe that's not hitting the mark quite as much as the other technologies. But I don't know if you had anything on that. But,
No.
yeah. Yeah, in the back? Yeah. Yeah, I've got one from Kickstarter coming in. I'm going to say the name wrong. I think it's called the Woojer. It's like Woojer. I've never actually heard it pronounced. I've just read it. Rig, and that's RYG. That is a 8 transducers vest, and the demos I've seen and the reactions I've seen is folks watching Jurassic Park and saying they can feel the rain going down their back. It's that kind of detail. You can see some really sophisticated variations of that. There's gloves where you can feel the feet of a spider and each individual appendage walking across the glove. Thing is, it's a very specialized demo for a very specialized environment with insane amount of hardware involved. By and large, haptics are pretty far behind in terms of where HMDs are versus haptics, but there's the Tesla suit, which you can look up, which is pretty promising. There's a number of different gloves, but by and large, that's not the area that's quite as accessible yet. But there is a lot of development in that space.
I was going to point out this this video. You can get away with a lot of haptic stuff just with the regular Vive controllers.
Yeah,
I'm sure with the Oculus controllers too. I don't have an Oculus, so I don't know. But
yeah, it's got
in this video, I'm going to knock down a wall with that hammer, and I had it so that every time it tapped a surface, it would vibrate, and so you could drag it along the wall and sort of feel it where it was. And also, if the objects are reacting physically, especially the ones that you're grabbing, it's almost like you feel resistance, because if they stop and you feel your hand, like your brain feels your arm keep going. And you can almost feel that resistance of if they're physically simulating, you know what I mean? So there's different tricks. If you just play with it enough, you can get more of a haptic simulation than you would otherwise.
You want to see some really good examples of what the future might be like. The Microsoft haptic team has put out a lot of really good YouTube videos up there.
That's true.
Apparently they hire a whole bunch of interns, they go hog wild with equipment that actually physically stops your hand from moving. Rigs where they actually hold one hand and use this to touch, retouch the block, and you feel the edge of the box, because this hand is anchoring it. So the experiments they're doing there are really great.
Yeah.
The very best experience I ever had with VR, the very first one, the first time I went out in Wild Vibe, was the archery game within the lab. I picked up a bow, now I'm an archer in real life. Picked up a bow, pulled the string, it vibrated, let go, tang. That was what I'm going to where an immersion occurred. So just small amount of vibration in the right spot can make a major
You can like feel the string tense up as you pull it back. Yeah.
And got a question in the back. Yeah.
How much are the haptics usually running, like in terms of cost?
Yeah, all over the place. The one I picked up, I think, is like $574-ish after early bird / thing. The retail is supposed to be like $799, and that's just for 8 transducer vests. You know what I mean? So, I mean, if you're talking about that Tesla suit that someday will be around, I mean, it's gonna be pricey. But again, we're talking about first gen hardware. I mean, it's even that cost, if you think about it, compared to what it used to be, it's pretty accessible. So. There's been a lot of research around haptics. A lot of folks who are involved in that research are very not optimistic about really being realistic anytime soon, but there are examples of kind of just experimentation around, especially using transducers, that I think is pretty impressive and definitely will add to that presence and immersion.
They say the numbers right now for VR, 1 or 2% of computers out there are VR.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
mean, that mind, the number of people who have haptic devices are close to about the same numbers. Most people do not have full string haptic devices. However, just the vibration is enough. One of the major complaints I have with the Oculus Go, and about the only thing I have, is the controller doesn't give me haptic feedback.
Yeah. And I mean, the Quest's probably going to address that with theirs, right?
I've actually been building pads.
Yeah, so. All right, I think we're about out of time. Does anybody have a last question before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you so much for coming out, and we'll be around.
Good job.